I was puzzled by what seemed to be a riddle. Why certain societies prosper more than other societies? It did not emerge in one day, not a topic taken out of the blue, as I said. I only gradually got acquainted with that because I went to places that were more successful and to other places that were less successful, and then I began traveling between those places, and in more concrete terms, in recent 20 years, I've been simply going to Iceland, to Newfoundland, to Catalonia, to Galicia. 4 interesting territories with very different conditions of life, very different quality of life. Some might be called more successful than others, according to certain criteria. Puzzling question was, how can it be explained? And because in all of these territories, or at least in 3 of these territories, much intellectual work was involved in the very making of these territories as entities. I got interested in those intellectuals, that is, people who wanted to design culture for others. They invented languages, they invented identities, they invented borders, and they invented subsequently much larger cultural repertoire. That is, they started telling people what to do, what to eat, what to dress, how to talk, how architecture should be. I could add very quickly and easily Italy to the number of cases. I was not doing field work in Italy, but I was studying, had been studying actually, the Italian case, so it could be added to these 4 territories, and there are many, many more examples. And sometimes these inventions succeeded. For instance, Italian has become the language of Italy, and Italy has become a state. Catalan has become a recognized language in Catalonia and has become stronger and stronger along the years, and Catalonia has recuperated its previous position in the Iberian Peninsula as a very strong group, as it were. Galicia, which was very poor and on the verge of collapse in many ways, recuperated its, did not recuperate, but actually managed to gradually take care of itself or control its own destiny. It is a debatable question whether the Galician language has really succeeded, but it is not debatable that with the help of the Galician language, the identity of the Galicians was strengthened to such a degree that perhaps the language is not needed anymore, because the identity in some way is there, very similar to the Scottish case, where people tried to revive and standardize and refabricate the Scottish language. For a while it seemed to be successful, and then the Scots gave up on it. Scottish intellectuals, that is, gave up on it, and they do not need a different Scottish language to reinforce the Scottish identity currently. And gradually I had a hypothesis that whether the inventions succeed or not, societies where such people are doing some work with some sort of intensity, in spite of what they devise or parallelly to what they devise, succeed more than other societies. they create some kind of noise. I was looking for some concept or for some term to describe that, and I settled for a term that was proposed by Fernand Braudel in his book on the Mediterranean, the culture of the Mediterranean. He speaks in that book about the sudden energy that is created in certain cities across the Mediterranean. All of a sudden there is industry, many people come there, intellectuals go there, sometimes governments choose such cities as the centers, and quality of life rises because people have more goods, more food, better dwelling conditions, transports is better between the city and other cities, and that can take 50 years, 20 years, a century, 2 centuries, etc., before such places may collapse. And why do they collapse? Because this kind of energy is not produced any longer, because criticism, as Andrew said this afternoon, is no longer allowed. Because if you express criticism or you suggest alternative ways, you are persecuted by the regime. Take the case of the great historian and the founder of world sociology, Ibn Khaldun, who had to leave his own town because his criticism was not well accepted by the regime. And he already criticizes what is going on in his society, saying that there is some sort of stagnation emerging in the Muslim culture of the time because there is no free flow of ideas. And that's in the 14th century. And I saw that from the point of view of the results, many people who devised new inventions eventually were very disappointed because these inventions did not stick or were not accepted. For instance, the most conspicuous case, perhaps the Galician language eventually will not be accepted by the majority of the Galicians. We don't yet know what will be the result, but many parents in Galicia recently voted for Spanish to be the language of instruction in many schools, and the Galician movement people were very cross with that. But my hypothesis was that whether it succeeds or not, energy has been created. That is, people have been talking, investing time, doing work, publishing, discussing, producing alternatives, etc., with one another, and so on. This is not the topic of my talk today, but this bundle of questions has led me to another question, that is, how do these intellectuals, I prefer calling them idea makers and culture entrepreneurs, yes, how these people manage to mobilize a larger number of people to support them. Because in Galicia, in Italy, I counted 120 people who were engaged in the Risorgimento movement, and these 120 people managed to persuade a large number of other peoples to support the idea of the state of Italy and of the Italian identity and the Italian language. In Galicia, I counted 30 people who were more or less engaged between the end of the 19th century and the end of the Franco period, at least as very active in the Resurdimento. Yes, no doubt Resurdimento was invented after the Italian Risorgimento, the revival movement in Galicia. How these 30 people managed to recruit hundreds, if not thousands of people to support them in political and other action. Surely we lack something. And I thought that the most natural thing to adopt was, again, maybe you would object to that, Bourdieu's idea of social capital. Social capital, something that is now being very much paid very much attention to in the literature, is the kind of capital created by groups in order to augment cooperation between them and settle the relationships in the group. The larger the social capital, again, the larger the social capital, the more chances that energy will be created, the more chances in other ways that the place will be more successful because people cooperate with one another. There are many examples in the literature about a tiny village where cooperation is so intense that the whole place simply is organized in a completely different way than the next village where no cooperation is operative, and where people are antagonistic to each other, and where there is no settlement of relations. You don't know who is who and how to treat others and how you are likely to be treated by others. This is basically the idea of social capital. I may be simplifying matters too much, but I don't want to dwell on it, because this is, again, only the beginning of my talk today. I was working on that. I was trying to understand how social energy emerges in connection with social capital. And then I received an invitation from a group of people to go to a conference in the University da Caspari in Venice, where they wanted to have a conference on polysystem theory all of a sudden. And they asked me to give a paper. And I said, well, I'm not likely to talk about polysystem theory, but if you allow, I will talk about something else, which is beyond or above or aside, to the left or the right of it. And they said, okay. We had a very good conference in Venice, 2 days, and there came a group of Icelanders. It was organized by medievalists. And here I must say that I have in my background I was in a way a medievalist, because I studied medieval Iceland and I studied medieval Arabic culture. So I am in a way, and I studied medieval Slavic culture, mostly Russian. So I can consider myself in a way, if not a full-fledged medievalist, at least an amateur medievalist. And my knowledge about Iceland actually did not begin with my culture research, but as a literary scholar. I went to Iceland and I was interested in the Icelandic sagas, and I began in the 80s to translate the Icelandic sagas into Hebrew, a project that I hope to accomplish before I die. So I came to the conference, and all of a sudden a strange idea emerged in my head. Why and in what context? There is a riddle which cannot be solved, or can hardly be solved, has not been solved by generations of scholars. How can you explain the fact that in such a remote island in the Atlantic Ocean, a tiny, not a tiny, but a small group of people produced more texts in medieval times than any other group except for the Muslim civilization and China? more than quantitatively, more text than France, England, Italy, Germany, Russia, Spain. Between 1,000 and 13,000. I mean, along some 200 or 250, maybe 300 years. How can it be accounted for? All sorts of texts. What we call today literary texts, historical texts, legal texts, all sorts of other documents. It would be absolutely justifiable to call it efflorescence. I borrowed the word from a scholar of ancient Egypt who spoke about the efflorescence of textual activity in Egypt, ancient Egypt, in antiquity. So I did not invent the word, I borrowed it. It's efflorescence in the sense that it grew out, as it were, out of the blue, and it dwindled after 3 centuries. Never have the Icelanders reached the same amount of verbal activity as in those times I described. There was nothing like that in the countries of origins where the Icelanders are believed to have come from. For instance, nothing like that in Norway, nothing like that in Sweden, nothing like that in Denmark. In Norway, many manuscripts have been preserved, among them a tremendous project of translating European, English, French and German literature, medieval literature, but it is believed that the manufacturers, the producers of the text were Icelanders, engaged in the service of the Norwegian king. We can distinguish between Old Norwegian and Old Icelandic by orthography and vocabulary to a certain extent. And those who are not familiar with the Icelandic production would be amazed to see, first of all, the quantity of texts, secondly, the nature of the texts. I know that we are not supposed to make any value judgments or evaluations of the quality of the text, but these texts, without entering the question of whether they are good or bad, excellent or not, fascinating or not, are by simple analysis of the textual models look very similar to modern texts. They could have been written partly in the 19th century. They have incredible literary strategies that we believe to have emerged, for instance, only within the movement of literary impressionism in Denmark, France, and other places. Many narrative techniques that are discussed in the literary theories, you know, that are believed to have emerged only in the 20th century with the modern novel. Some psychological, very delicate, very subtle psychological description of the characters without the intervention of the writer. Many such narrative techniques that look very modern and which make these texts, I believe, highly readable to a modern reader. They do not read like the other medieval texts we know, that some of which are quite boring for a modern reader, if I may say so. They are almost all entirely in prose, and they must have been very popular in the times because some works have a lot of copies. For instance, the saga about a hero called Njal has more than 60 manuscripts. So we can reconstruct, we cannot really reconstruct an ur-text really, and I don't believe in the possibility, and no one believes in the possibility of reconstructing the original text, but something very close to the original can be reconstructed with the help of these texts, and they are in any way very fascinating because of the differences between them. How can it be accounted for? People say, you will find very funny explanations in the literature. For instance, Icelanders had a long night. They didn't have anything to do during those nights, and so they began to tell stories to each other. So, well, immediately you raise the question, why this didn't happen in similar places all over the globe, where you had the same kind of night. People did not tell stories to each other, or even if they did not preserve it, they did not put it on paper or on parchment. Yes, it was parchment to begin with, and they were not preserved by generations. These people are obsessed by their history. Someone devised a project, a historical project. He went interviewing Icelanders. You know, it's an island, so he started in the direction of the clock, like that, going from one farm to the next, interviewing people. And the result of those interviews, many stories about how these farms had emerged, how the ancestors of the owners of the farms had arrived in Iceland, etc., took possession of the territory, etc. A relatively thick volume that's called Landnámabók, that is the book of the settlement, the book of the taking of the land, literally. Even in Old English, before they borrowed the word take, in Old English the verb is nauma, nauman, not naman, not take. Take is Scandinavian. Another one wrote a small book. We know the person by name. Yes, Ari the Learned in the 11th century wrote a book, Íslendingabók, the book of the Icelanders, where he describes where the Icelanders came from, how they discovered Greenland, how they discovered Iceland, how Erik the Red settled, etc. So, and then there is the masterpiece by Snorri Sturluson, who was very proliferous, versatile Icelandic intellectual, murdered by some assassins sent by the King of Norway because he was defending the freedom of Iceland and would not accept the proposals by the Norwegian king to succumb to his reign. So Snorri Sturluson, Snorri the son of Sturla, he wrote a voluminous book about the history of the kings of Norway, not about Iceland. It's called Heimskringla Saga, that is the story about the Orbis Terrarum. How shall I translate that? About the globe. Yes, a story about the globe. Saga actually means story. Can be translated with the English word story or history. It also has entered the vocabulary in many languages as a sui generis sort of text, but that's not really justified. When I translate a saga, by the way, I write a story about Njál, not Njál, the saga about Njál. A story about Egil, not the saga about Egil. Now, where does this obsession about history come from? We can explain that. Yes, people go to a new country, they take possession of lands, they are interested in their origins, they want to describe. I mean, people who are stable at their autochthonous territory do not always develop such an obsessive interest in their origins, because they are there. They have been there for centuries, and even if they had migrated at some time from other places, there is no memories. There are no memories about it. But the Icelanders remember that they are a new group, and the territory is new to them, and they are obsessed with describing what happened. But how can the literary texts be explained? Now, the so-called literary texts are not literary in the sense of the European novel, in spite of what I said about the techniques. The techniques are modern, but the contents of the stories are mostly not about fictitious persons, or they at least pretend not to be stories about fictitious persons, but they pretend to be stories about real persons who lived in Iceland, whole families. There is a whole collection of sagas about families. Family sagas is a genre, is recognized as a genre. And therefore, they are also a kind of a prolongation or a continuation of the historical texts, but in different terms. Yes, they are like historical novels or historical films where you try to recreate history. You try to make history more accessible. But behind all that, and every Icelandic scholar accept that, every saga scholar accept that, there is a subtext in both historical, other documents, and literary text, and that is the dispute about legitimacy and possessions. It is not only general interest by a group of people to learn about their origins, but the specific interest of certain families belonging probably to the Icelandic elite, those who have taken the major territories, who have assumed the highest positions in society, to claim legitimacy over their possessions, because possessions, the sagas are about the quarrel about possessions very much. You see, you claim the territory, your neighbor claims part of the territory. Your neighbor, the next farmer, wants part of your land. And then you say, no, this is my land. I have inherited it from my father, who inherited it from my grandfather, who came to Iceland and he found a place. The very founder of Iceland, according to those stories, Ingólfur Arnarson, Ingolf, the son of Arni, is supposed to have discovered this, what is now the city of Reykjavik, by throwing 2 pieces of wood into the ocean, saying that where the woods would arrive on land, he would settle. And the 2 pieces of wood simply were swept into the place that is now Reykjavik, and Ingólfur Arnarson settled there in what is now number 11 in Austurstræti, the street number, it's called Eistur, number 11, which is in front of the Bank of Iceland. He settled down there, and there is a statue, an enormous statue of him close to the city hall of Reykjavik, looking like that. All the descendants of Ingólfur Arnarson had perfect legitimation for owning the land. No one could contest their rights as owners of land. And it is absolutely clear that many of those texts have been written certainly to entertain, we know that people like to be entertained. For instance, there are several stories in the sagas about entertainment. A certain gentleman comes to visit, for a visit to a certain home, and when the evening approaches, the host asks this guest, "How would you like us to entertain you? Would you like a dance? Would you like to be read some poems to? Would you like us to read to you a story, a saga?" And then he says, "Yes, I would prefer to be read to a saga about Thomas of Canterbury." Because he was such a pious person that he mostly liked this saga about Thomas of Canterbury. The saga of Thomas of Canterbury is a translation. Yes, it's not an original work in Icelandic. But much of it is about contests, about rivalry. There are many, in almost all of the sagas, you have lawsuits. Icelanders are obsessed with the law. In the saga of Njal, there is a certain free translation from the Psalms, from the Bible, where they say, "With the law a land shall be built, and with the lack of law a land shall be destroyed." Yes. Melechum skal land bygjas. With the law you can see how much Icelandic you know. Lech lo. Skal land bygjas. Yes, very much like Swedish. My contention then was, and I'm not pretending I've solved the riddle, but maybe I may have contributed to a better understanding of this verbal efflorescence in Iceland, that when a new group of people arrive at a new territory that is mostly uninhabited, and they have not had any relations with each other before, because some of them come from Western Norway, and some of them come from the Hebrides, and some of them come directly, thank you, from Ireland. Some of them are Irish, by the way, mostly women, and some of them come from northern parts of Norway. So they had not had any kind of agreements between them, among them. They have not had any social settlements. They didn't know who was who, how the territories would be managed, what kind of rules should prevail. They could imitate the Norwegian ways, but they probably did not wish to, because they didn't want to have a king. They did not agree on having a government. There was never a government in Iceland until 1262, when Iceland was annexed by Norway. No real government. They only created little by little what was to be called the general, national meeting. Not national is not a good word. The general meeting, congregation, the althing. The same word as English, thing, with the English word al, means all, the whole thing. Some Icelanders believe it was a parliament, but I think they exaggerate very much. It was not a parliament. It was a place where the notables from various regions arrived. They discussed matters of law. There was one person who had to recite every year parts of the unwritten book of laws. And he was the law sayer, Lögmaður, the man of the law. And in modern terms, he might be compared to someone that would slightly look like a speaker of the parliament or a president of the country. But he had no governing rights. He only could recite the law. And people respected him for his ability to recite the law. So that was his position. It took some time for where did that law come from? It probably crystallized during the first and a half centuries after the settlement of Iceland, were no verbal, or at least to our knowledge, no verbal texts were produced in such enormous quantities. And of course, in that congregation, which convened once every year in summer for a whole month, people came to live there for a while, through the month of July. There were no decisions, only decisions about people who should be outlawed or some such, but many people simply did not accept the verdict, and there was no police to enforce it. But in the course of those years, it is more and more, becomes more and more evident that this group of people managed gradually, we can even try to reconstruct how gradually and at what dates, although there is much discussion among historians about that, managed to create a body, large body or large size, if you wish, of social capital. They were very much engaged in doing it because it was necessary. Without it, the whole country would fall into chaos. People would simply murder one another. People would simply try to invade each other's territories. People would not help each other in times of famine or lack of food, or when imports were terribly necessary. I mean, they still depended on many imports, mostly from Norway, but also from the British Isles. Some people received these imports or functioned as importers themselves and sold the merchandise to others, and that required some sort of agreements. And my contention is that much verbal work was necessary in order to make these agreements, in order to generate this kind of social capital. Because in other settled societies, there is some such work going on all the time, but it is not always that all societies need such a huge quantity of verbalism and much textual work to achieve the goal, because these texts have become circulating goods. That is, they were copied and copied again and distributed across the island. And with the reciting of the law, everyone who came to the annual convention in summer at least could listen and heard some of the laws being recited. Not everyone was a learned person, and there were almost professional lawyers in Iceland to remind people of certain laws that were not written but spoken, recited by the law sayer, by the lögmaður. And I think we can find parallels to this phenomenon in other societies, mostly new societies. I wouldn't like to draw simplistic analogies to the modern societies I was investigating, but I truly believe that we can draw some parallels between medieval Iceland and modern Italy, because in the 19th century, all of a sudden, you have a plethora of verbal activity many texts are being written in the new language to propagate the language, to propagate the new ideas before the foundation of Italy, after the foundation of Italy. People are even engaged by the government to write books like De Amicis, who writes Il Cuore as a pedagogical book, Collodi, who writes Pinocchio as a pedagogical book in order to inculcate ideas of work and diligence and loyalty and other virtues that are necessary for the building of the new society. And it seems, if you look at the quantity of text that is being produced in Italy between 1830 and 1870, that's the time between the emergence of this Risorgimento more or less, and the establishment of the Italian state in 1860 and the annexation of Rome in 1870, many of these texts are now forgotten. But in comparison with what happened before, you have an efflorescence of textual work in Italy. You have an incredible efflorescence of sexual activity in Catalonia in the 19th century with the Catalanisme, with the Catalan movement, that you didn't have before, and there is nothing like it. I mean, there is nothing like it. Nothing like that ever has happened in Andalusia, Extremadura, Castilla León, or Asturias, or even the major region of Madrid. This kind of incredible need to write texts, the major vehicle for propagating new attitudes that emerge in Catalonia. I could also say the same about Galicia, because in Galicia, or Galicia I should say in English, there was nothing produced. Absolutely nothing, and all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but gradually between 1860 and the beginning of World War I and World War I, you have more and more text written in a language that even the Galeguistas, the Galician movement activists, didn't know it had existed before in history. They thought they invented a new language on the basis of the vernacular. They didn't even know that such notorious, famous characters like Alfonso Savio, the King of Spain, wrote his poems in what is now called, at least historically, Galician. Curiously, they didn't know about that. So, the case of Iceland, in this respect, and I can give you many more examples, from the Balkan countries, from Czechoslovakia, from Russia, this kind of short periods of time when a tremendous production of text is visible. The question why? I think it is a vehicle to producing social order, social agreements, social cultural agreements, social capital, in short, that is a precondition for a society to create social energy. Social energy meaning certain activity and certain disposition, we used the word disposition the other day, to be engaged in coping with heterogeneous situations. When this does not exist in Iceland after 1262, little by little, there are no texts anymore, or very little text. All the texts that are being produced are just copies of older texts. There is no social cooperation. Iceland falls into anarchy. In the 14th century, there is something that is very much like a civil war. People really kill each other. The climate is worsening because of the little ice era. The way to Greenland is blocked. In the 15th century, the Danes take over because there is no longer a Norwegian kingdom. In the 18th century, the size of the Icelandic people falls to 70,000 people, and the Danish government considers transporting all of them to Copenhagen. They could simply live in one street in Copenhagen. That was the solution devised by the Danish government. And the poverty that now prevails in a society that used to be relatively rich, materially and otherwise, in previous century, is undescribable. And even throughout the 19th century, and up to the Declaration of Independence of Northern Iceland in 1944, what characterizes Iceland is poverty, because you could be either a fisherman, quite poor, or a farmer with very limited access to agricultural production, and some, free positions. So to finish my talk, because I see Anthony is getting impatient, to finish my talk, I would say that I would hesitate to call it a hypothesis, but I at least would say it's a contention, or it's a good idea, si non è vero è ben trovato, yes, as they say in Italian, that there is a very strong connection between verbal work, I'll call verbal work any kind of textual production prevailing in a society, and the creation of social energy, that means agreements, cooperation, order, and ability to cope with heterogeneity. Well, that's in a nutshell what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much.